So we might not even pass 144, but yeah. All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be covering some parts in well, basically Surah Al-An'am, but we left off right there in regards to the Tafseer al-Qurtubi, and we said, let's say, ثمانية أزواج من الضأن اثنين والمعز اثنين قل الذكرين حرم أم الأنثيين أما اشتملت عليه أرحام الأنثيين نبئوني بعلم إن كنتم صادقين. So al-Qurtubi wanted to seize the moment. Let me just tell you one thing, just a reminder. Al-Qurtubi dedicated his book of Tafseer. Let's just remember page 79, so we would remember where we're at. Okay, dedicated his book of Tafseer, and I want you to look at this. Yes, he's Maliki, and he called his book Al-Jami' li-Ahkam al-Quran. It's basically I guess, what would bring about an accumulation to all the different ayat that relate to legislature, or the ayat that basically speak about legislation, that speak about rulings, basically. And certainly, if you were to look at other books like Al-Jassas, if you were to go for Ahkam al-Quran ibn al-Arabi, Al-Jassas is Hanafi, Ahkam al-Quran ibn al-Arabi is Maliki. You got Ahkam al-Quran for Shafi'i as well. You got, a couple different books that are exclusive to just Ahkam al-Quran. Salusa, I believe, Ali Salus, and there are a couple. So when you look at the books of Tafsir, the books of Tafsir are different kinds. Some are dedicated to only studying legislature. Others are only dedicated to studying just the Lugha Arabiya in it, and basically discussing just the Arabic semantics, grammar, basically all that area. And you have other books of tafsir. They're exclusively just looking into the ahadith, or what would be called al-ma'thur. And when we say al-ma'thur, we're talking about all the different resources in terms of hadith, in terms of Sahaba and what they said about this ayah and all of that. That would be ma'thur. So it's kind of like a tabari. That's actually one of the most important books. Okay, then you also have other types of tafsir that are not necessarily exclusive to one particular path, and I guess, tackling one particular path. And you have some of those tafsir that basically go in trying to simplify all areas within the tafsir. So you have something like Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir goes in all corners, not necessarily going into the same type of detail when it comes to a matter on fiqh. So definitely not even close not even close to al-Qurtubi, because al-Qurtubi is more dedicated to what he called his book as al-Jami' al-Ahkam al-Quran wal-Mubayyin lima tadammanahu min as-sunnati wa ayah al-Furqan. So basically a clarification to what is consisted of all the different things about sunnah and the different ayat that relate to rulings. Okay. When you look at Ibn Kathir, it's quite different, because Ibn Kathir can sometimes go into different corners, but not necessarily, like I said, not necessarily going into legislature. But here's what I want to do. I want to do al-Qurtubi right there and look at what al-Qurtubi had said in regards to this ayah. Although I must admit, sometimes we may agree and disagree, but sometimes he definitely may go a little detailed and a little off track when it comes to a tafsir and legislature, that sometimes he may sometimes get carried away with legislature, and which really is irrelevant to perhaps what that ayah is saying, but he will discuss it because scholars of fiqh may have used that ayah as the foundation to researching a particular matter in fiqh, so he basically just included it. And that's what you would see right there in this ayah. You're going to see that we're going to be discussing a number of different things that, they questioned, is this ayah? And right there, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ, especially this ayah, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِيمَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا عَلَى طَاعِمٍ يَطْعَمُهُ إِلَّا أَن يَكُونَ مَيْتَةً أَوْ دَمًا مَسْفُوحًا أَوْ لَحْمَ خِنْزِيرٍ فَإِنَّهُ رِجْسٌ. Now, here's the thing. So we had talked about last time, when we discussed this ayah, how this ayah was exposing the disbelievers, basically legislation, whether on food or whether in ritual, and how they designated certain animals to women or to men, or probably even forbid certain foods and on women, but then permitted it for men and so forth. What the Quran wanted to expose is their discrepancy and also their centricity upon themselves, and that it doesn't actually have a basis, whether we're speaking about a basis from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or whether we're speaking about a basis in, regarding something right or wrong. What is your basis? What is the reference that you're going to be using here? So from that ayah, you could see that it continues and say, I do not find anything that is impermissible on anybody that wants to consume anything, unless this is carry on. In other words, this is a dead meat, or a blood that is gushing blood, or even this swine flesh, basically, for it is all rich, it's all impure, or fisqan uhilla lighayri Allahi bih, fisqan uhilla lighayri Allahi bih, or it's basically a transgression attributed and basically slaughtered for other than the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَإِنَّ رَبَّكَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. Whoever basically falls within ad-darura, or what is considered a necessity, then in that situation, if they're not with the intention to exceed the limit or transgress or even go against the Lord Almighty, then the Lord Almighty is all forgiving. Okay, now with al-Qurtubi, let's look into this one, because when they're discussing this ayah, now I'm going to break it down for a bit, and then we're going to go in details. Okay, scholars actually had differences of opinions when this ayah says, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِيمَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا. I do not find anything as impermissible except the following items. Now, scholars generally, because the wording is saying, well, I do not find anything that is impermissible but these items, is this necessarily the final ayah? Therefore, anything that is not part of this is basically going to be halal. Guess what? To say this, that carries the inference that you're talking about alcohol, you're talking about perhaps maybe carnivore animals, you're talking about so many things, as the Prophet ﷺ had talked about mules, talked about donkeys, talked about birds that have claws, so carnivore birds or carnivore animals or mammals, etc. So does that mean that all of that was history and therefore this changed and this was the final ayah? Or was this ayah Mecki, and therefore later a hadith explained further or later ayat explained further that, well, this isn't exclusive, but that this ayah is saying, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِي مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا, basically within the context of the revelation, within that ayah, at least up till that time. Okay, so the other scholars that debated, so, well, which one is first and which one is last? Because if you say that this is last, if you say that this is the last ayah in that regard, well, that would actually put a lot of those different things that we had regarded as haram as halal. Like I said, carnivore animals, carnivore birds, let's say even alcohol, etc. Because this is basically saying, that's it. This is the only thing. If you are to say that this is a Meccan surah, therefore it's a Meccan ayah, then in that situation, you're going to say, well, looking at the context that it was revealed in, basically during the time of Mecca, Islam was still in the state of evolution. It was still in the state of revelation, basically coming in to bring in not only a development and new basically education on what discipline they should be going into / legislature and sort of and all those different details really didn't happen until the Prophet ﷺ went to Medina. But because of this ayah, and because certainly sometimes that area of timing and sometimes debating on when and what was revealed last, and certainly debating on certain words that were mentioned by certain Sahaba, that actually sometimes had caused some confusion in understanding, well, how do we understand what really is haram? Is this ayah making it exclusive to only these foods being haram, dead meat, gushing blood, pork, and certainly the things that were slaughtered to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or is there more to come? Okay, so most of the scholars, they basically said that this ayah was basically to refute and to expose the disbelievers on the matter of the different idols or even the different animals. So the different animals, they would consider that certain, let's say, camels were exclusive to particular gods, certain rituals that they basically had practiced, and based on this practice, this ayah was revealed to tell them, well, with this practice, I want to teach you basically the basics and the basis of what makes something permissible and what basically does not make something permissible. Okay, now here's the thing, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, ما في بطون هذه الأنعام خالصة لذكورنا ومحرم على أزواجنا, meaning that what is inside the wombs of these animals basically based on what they had said, that it was exclusive to the males and not including the females. In other words, as long as it is born alive, then they get to choose what's to be given to women, and it's usually dead meat. So for the women, they give them dead meat. For the women, they basically give them what usually is not considered the best, I guess, food source. So they would give that for the women because anyways, they considered them inferior. So to keep them alive, we'll just give them what we usually are disgusted of eating. So we'll just give it to them to consume. And certainly, well, they didn't just create that ritual, but even when it comes to the rituals and relationship with the idols and what they do, and this ayah was basically right there coming to refute their ritual, refute the epistemology and the basis of what they regarded as their resource of information. And simply, of course, this is also to let us know of a main thing in fiqh, which is an-nazar wal-qiyas. Let me stop here for a second. This ayah basically uses logic and tells us, well, if you're going to be considering that some animals are permissible and others are not, well, what about the fact that the female is the one that's going to contain the male in her abdomen, basically talking about the animals here, and therefore, on what basis are you going to judge the mother and the son? Are you going to consider it holy? Are you not going to consider it holy? In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is exposing their discrepancy. But I want to say one thing. The Quran uses a lot of times the method of analogy, the method of exposing discrepancy or contradiction and so forth. Now, when you see الأشباه والنظائر, we do have books that are labeled al-ashbah wal-nadha'ir. What does that even mean? So al-ashbah means the things that are similar to one another. Al-nadha'ir means things that may have similarities. So we're talking about things that are one containing some similarities, paradigms, mainly in paradigms, and you have ashbah, things that are similar to, similar to one another. Okay, why did I even mention that one? I wanted to mention that one because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that in fiqh, there are certain paradigms. And from these paradigms, the scholars of fiqh, they were inspired to understand, to research basically fiqh, to understand paradigms, to set certain laws that combine the different pieces of fiqh in what is called al-qawa'id al-fiqhiyya. القواعد الفقهية, they're basically a set of different rules and that are written more of a canonized, like a canonized formula or a canonized rule. And under this rule basically falls a number of different chapters in fiqh, and that makes it easy. I'll give you something as an example. We would say إذا تعارضت مفسدتان روعي أعظمهما ضررا بارتكاب أخفهما. If we have two evils, we're going to consider the larger evil, the bigger evil, even if we are going to need to basically go through a smaller evil. Well, this is more of a logic. But of course, when you look at qawa'id fiqhiyya, it basically benefited a lot from logic, benefited a lot from philosophy and so forth. So when you look at an-nadhar wal qiyas, this is basically letting us know that the scholars, when they studied fiqh, they did consider ashbah wal nadha'ir and even analogy. And certainly wanted to say, well, if here's an evidence that proves this ayah basically is showing them the paradigms that can be used in order to understand logic, to understand legislature, to understand ethics and what makes something as basically ethical or not, and so forth. Now, here's one thing. Of course, the ayah was exposing that by saying, "Nabbi'uni bi'ilm." I want you to give me the ilm which proves what you were saying. And certainly they didn't really have that ilm. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Am kuntum shuhada," or were you witnesses on that? In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting them know that the whole idea of your culture. Now, of course, this doesn't mean we're going to be attacking every culture, okay? But Islam basically lets us know that just because a culture or a certain practice becomes basically the dominant chosen practice by a certain group of people, that doesn't make it as the right thing to do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted the Muslim to be vigilant, wanted the Muslim to go beyond just being, I guess, indoctrinated or being blindly basically, taking a certain idea or, agreeing with a certain idea, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to be awakened and recognize how and what resources and how these ideas had come to being and what resources exist. Now, this is not to mean that culture is necessarily bad. not everything in cultures is bad and not everything is good. In fact, culture is basically based on an ideology. There's a certain ideology, a certain vision in how you understand the world, how you understand life, how you understand the aftermath of life, how you understand the purpose, how you understand ethics, all of these different things. And then this starts blending this type of accumulative thinking within a group of people, and certainly that becomes a culture. So there is an American culture, there's a British culture, there's I guess, same thing in African culture, or at least one, you can't say African culture, but you should be saying, because Africa is a whole continent, it's kind of like saying Asian culture, but at least, certain West culture, maybe West Africa, maybe East Africa, there are certain things that those group of people would basically organize themselves into making communication easier, and sometimes making the relationship with one another, even without words, that we would expect to follow a certain paradigm, a certain walk of life, a certain responsibility, a certain right, etc. And then we would complete one another without needing to over and over start distributing chores or distributing tasks or distributing where we're at around this. So, of course, whether we're speaking about the geography, the terrain, we're talking about politics, we're talking about gender, certainly, we're talking about perhaps maybe even weather, sometimes all of these different things, they become or of course, most importantly, is basically the religion that that group of people basically follows. All of that combination basically creates a certain culture. Just keep that one in mind. And that's why Islam is not necessarily against culture, but Islam did recognize that those experiences, they are necessary, and therefore we do not necessarily target the culture. In fact, in fiqh, we would consider culture as one of the references, but on a condition that there would be no ijtihad if there is a text. There would be no objection, not because something is a culture. And I want you to keep this one in mind. I get a lot of people telling me, hey, polygamy, as an example, would be haram because the American culture does not approve of it. No, you understood your fiqh wrong. No culture, no legislature goes beyond the legislature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if there is the area of mubah, there's the area of mubah, an area that is permissible, then certainly respect the rules in the country that you're living in. But if it is something that Islam had regarded as permissible, Islam had regarded as basically something within the legislation of Islam, then no one's laws goes beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to somehow say, yeah, we're supposed to be respecting the laws that in the country that we're living in, and therefore we have to, ban certain ayat or ban certain legislations in the Quran, that is kufr on the spot. That is kufr on the spot. The thing is that people, many times you could say Muslims would take quotes and don't really know where that quote and how it's applied. Just wanted to mention that one, that when we're speaking about kuntum shuhada, or even the ayah in terms of legislature, or when we're talking about analogy, that there is a reference to understand, that we go back to the text in order to help us understand how we connect, one, the resources, the data, and the interpretation together to make sure that we are understanding the things around us, or even giving the interpretation based on Quran and Sunnah and not based on our own selves. So, okay. Oh dear, hold on. My laptop was telling me it was going to be out of battery. It's going to die. Okay, you're all saved. Alhamdulillah. Okay. قل لا أجد فيما أوحي إلي محرما على طاعم يطعمه إلا أن يكون ميتة أو دما مسفوحا أو لحم خنزير. Now, al-Qurtubi says there are 4 different matters in relationship to this ayah. And number 1, he said in this ayah, and just basically this quote, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِيمَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا. What does it mean? And say, I do not find anything from what was revealed unto me as impermissible and forbidden except these matters. Okay, so if you were saying that, what does that mean? Within this context, this is basically saying, well, I am not finding that the revelation that I am receiving, that it is including basically what you had said, and therefore I'm not going to take your culture as my legislature. Do it again. I'm not going to take your culture as my legislation, because me as a Muslim, or the Prophet ﷺ basically saying, well, as a prophet that received a revelation, that basically goes on top, and that goes as the reference that I would basically look through in order to understand what makes something acceptable, permissible, or rejected, and so forth. Okay, just keep that one in mind. Because we're going to get to that one. And that's very important when we're speaking about culture. Remember, just because something is within culture, again, we don't necessarily just reject it right away. That's why as a qaida fiqhiyya, we would say al-'adatu muhakkima or muhakkama. Both. You had different scholars basically read it, or at least pronounced it differently. What's the difference between muhakkima and muhakkama? So muhakkima, that it itself is a reference. Muhakkama, that's what would be the definitive answer, the definitive at least reference. Okay, so that's muhakkima and muhakkama. At the end of the day, whether you're talking about definitive or whether you're going to be speaking about the reference itself that we would turn to, it basically means the same thing. So this is to let us know that culture is a resource that we would turn to. Having that being said, al-urf, or at least the culture itself, when we look at Muslim cultures, pay attention to this one. When we look at Muslim cultures, many times, depending on the area, some Muslim cultures basically come from a certain fiqh standpoint. So if you were to go to, let's say, a Somali culture, a lot of Somali culture basically comes from the Shafi'i madhab. If you were to probably go to maybe al-Khalij, basically the Gulf countries, well, that basically reflects a lot from what the Hanbali madhab had regarded. If you were to go to North Africa, or at least northern/central Africa, you are basically seeing cultures blending with madhab Maliki, whether they knew it or they didn't know it. They may not know necessarily that their culture was really centered, and I would say feeding at one point in history from the Maliki madhab, but it is basically something that is true. The other day, my son, he was asking me, in khutbat al-Jumu'ah here in Malaysia, they would carry a stick. Well, that's because for not only a stick, but they have to wear something on their head, because in the Shafi'i madhab, they debated and disputed whether a man can pray hasir al-ras, with his head basically not having any hat or any turban or anything like that. So you would see that, before they come to pray, they would carry, or at least, wear something on their head, because they would consider that that is خوارم المروءة, that would nullify even the prayer. They went as that far. Or carrying a stick, because they considered that that's the sunnah that you would have to do when you are making khutbah al-Jumu'ah and so forth. Now, when people don't realize where this is coming from, just, keep that one in mind. And of course, every single madhab, when you look at madhab al-Shafi'i, for example, in Malaysia or Indonesia, you could see slight differences comparing perhaps maybe Yemen, or perhaps maybe Somalia. The way they would practice al-madhab al-Shafi'i is slightly different. If you were to go to Turkey, madhab Hanafi, and you were to probably compare the madhab Hanafi and the way that it is practiced, perhaps in Afghanistan, you're going to see a lot of variation. And certainly a number of different reasons affected that. Number one, sometimes the terrain, the culture, the culture itself basically comes from experiences, comes from a number of different political situations, from a number of different, I guess, what suited that group of people, or sometimes even when we're speaking about a certain history and a closeness in a certain group of people, that it's an experience, etc., wars, politics, non-Muslims being, I guess, next to them, etc. All of these different things will definitely affect how a madhab is generated, and what selections within that madhab basically becomes the let's call it the dominant fatwa within that particular area. Okay, now why am I saying this, and why am I talking about this? I'm basically talking about this just for us to understand how sometimes these influences on those madhab, or on those, let's call them selected fatwa, is real and can be something that we can definitely see even in the books of fiqh. Okay, let's see. So going to that ayah, back to that ayah. Al-ayah Makkiyah. That's the first thing that al-Qurtubi wanted to say. Okay, what are you trying to say? Said, well, this was actually one of the earliest in Revelation. And he said, before that, there was nothing in Sharia that was regarded as impermissible to consume except these items. So then Surah Al-Ma'idah was revealed in Medina. So when you say Surah Al-Ma'idah, remember in Surah Al-Ma'idah, it basically gave us more details, and we went into speaking about the animals and what they hunt, and dogs, and the different types of animals, and all these different things that are considered as halal, haram. How do we understand things like alligators? Are they forbidden or permissible to eat? What about things like amphibians? They're, partly in water. Are they considered sea animals, or what do you consider them? Land animals, but they have a canonite. All these different things. Then you had the scholars basically debating that, but it's not enough to just debate it based on your culture, but we need to see the evidences that supported it from text. So that's why you could see in Surah Al-Ma'idah, since it was revealed in Medina, it basically added definitely a lot more, and it talked about al-munkhaniqa wal-mawqudha wal-mutaraddiya wal-natiha. And you could see in Surah Al-Ma'idah, it went in different details and talked about the different animals that may fall from heights, or different animals that may probably get into bumping heads together, or a different animal that probably had something falling over its head, and all of these different things. And certainly even al-khamr was also basically revealed to be forbidden in the Quran itself. And certainly we know the story about the gradual process of making it forbidden, but just to keep that one in mind. And the Prophet ﷺ in Medina, he said, had forbidden the consumption of every single carnivore animal. So if it has a canine tooth, that means it's a carnivore animal. Or if it's a bird that basically has claws, that means it uses it to consume meat, and therefore it would not be permissible to eat. Stop for a second. Here we go. And he said, but scholars had differences of opinions on this ayah and how they understood it. And there were multiple opinions in regards to this ayah. The first opinion basically said, well, this ayah is Makkiyah, meaning it was revealed early in the times when the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca before Hijrah, and that everything that the Prophet ﷺ had regarded as haram later, whether we're speaking about what was annexed or added to in Revelation in the Quran, or whether we're speaking about things that the Prophet ﷺ himself basically pointed out in different ahadith, and that would be considered as an appendix, as an ayah that, or a hadith that basically gives me further details on what is actually considered as what was revealed to being haram. Okay. Majority of the scholars regard that. And I want you to look at this word that he used. He said, على هذا أكثر أهل العلم من أهل النظر والفقه والأثر. Wow. Okay, what does that mean? He said, most scholars that basically are coming from another scrutiny, al-fiqh, understanding, al-athar, and strong connection with basically going back to the sunnah and basically back to the text itself, they basically would adopt this opinion. And he said, well, this is similar to the woman basically being a co-wife with her aunt or maternal aunt or paternal aunt, that we would regard it as impermissible to have a man marry the woman's aunt and her paternal aunt or maternal aunt and bring her as a co-wife, that you cannot marry them in one marriage. And even though the ayah says, even though the ayah says everything beyond what was mentioned in that ayah in Surah An-Nisa, but then certainly no scholar would say that. That's the same thing when we're talking about other basically examples, and certainly when it comes to women's witnessing on legal matters. And he said, well, legal matters, well, if you were to look at the ayah, فَإِن لَمْ يَكُونَا رَجُلَيْن فَرَجُلٌ وَامْرَأَتَانِ. If they were not two men, then it would be one man and two women. And certainly we had seen, and we discussed this before, in relationship to certain crimes or certain basically certain issues, that it would not necessarily ask for two men, but it may actually ask for two women instead. Wait a minute, why? Isn't that a contradictory with the ayah? It sure is. But as explained by the Prophet ﷺ, that in circumstances that relate to women, then we're going to take two women as witnesses. And in circumstances that may not necessarily relate to women alone, but sometimes they would go into dispute if we're speaking about, is this speaking about transactions? Is this talking about crime? In other words, is this talking about which area can or does a woman's witness be, where does it become as not strong enough to basically be as a strong evidence to support in order to be a witness on a case? What about different cases that don't necessarily get all the way to maybe killing someone? What about witnessing that zina incident, or witnessing perhaps maybe a transaction? What if she's an accountant? All of these different questions would arise, and the scholars would dispute it. Okay, let's see. Other scholars, they said, no, this ayah is basically abrogated. Abrogated? What do you mean? So what abrogated? Others said, well, what abrogated this ayah is basically the ahadith themselves, along with the ayat, But the hadith, you got one hadith, أكل كل ذي ناب من السباع حرام. Here's this quote that the Prophet ﷺ said, eating everything that has a canine tooth from the carnivore animals is impermissible. Can't be as clear as that. And you could say that this hadith is basically an authentic hadith, and it's basically a hadith that is sahih. The other opinion basically said al-ayatu muhkama. Well, the opposite of mansukha is muhkama. It's either going to be muhkama or it's going to be mansukha. There's no other option. So what's the difference? Well, mansukha basically means that we've got one verse that came early and then another verse that came either to complete it or to basically cancel out the previous ruling. Okay. Other scholars, they said, no, it's muhkama. Okay, what does that mean? Meaning that no, it was not abrogated, and therefore this is true, but they considered that لا يحرم إلا ما فيها. Only the things mentioned in it are considered haram and nothing else. Okay. And who actually adopted this opinion? Ibn Abbas, Ibn Umar, Aisha, and some scholars actually said other than that. Okay, let's say, because you're talking about other Sahaba that said, actually, now we know the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4. And just like Ali ibn Abi Talib, he said, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say that the donkey's meat was going to be impermissible till Judgment Day. Okay, let's see. Imam Malik, since of course al-Qurtubi is Maliki, let's say what he wanted to say in regards to Imam Malik. And he said, لا حرام بين إلا ما ذكر في هذه الآية. He said, there's nothing that is at least haram that is in such clarification except what was mentioned in this ayah. And let's say Ibn Khuwaizim and that he's basically one of those Maliki scholars that was living in Iraq. Wait a minute, I thought Malikis were only in Morocco, Algeria, and Mauritania and those countries. No, you also had certain Maliki scholars in Baghdad, certain Maliki scholars in Egypt, certain Maliki scholars in Bahrain, certain Maliki scholars at the time. You also had Maliki scholars, remember, because Imam Malik was Imam Dar al-Hijrah. He was actually the Imam in Medina. So you were talking about Medina was also considered at the time all following Imam Malik's madhab. Okay, so what did this Maliki scholar that is from Iraq basically saying? He said, well, what this ayah contained, the permissibility of all the different things from animals except what was mentioned in this ayah, whether we're speaking about dead meat or whether we're speaking about the gushing blood or whether we're speaking about pork. And he said, and that's why we said everything, whether we're speaking about carnivore animals, all other animals except pork is permissible. Repeat that again. Did I hear this right? Did I hear that he said that eating any animals, including lions and tigers and bears, that it's permissible? And the only things that are haram are basically what was mentioned in this ayah? Yes, you heard right. That's exactly what he claimed. Yes, he said that. Okay, wait a minute. Hold on. Is this agreed upon? Yeah, well, hold on. We're going to get there. Okay. Al-Tabari, well, he's Shafi'i. He says, and upon this ayah, الشافعي had said, تعليل كل مسكوت عنه أخذا من هذه الآية إلا ما دل عليه الدليل. Here's another one. Well, that, guess what? This is a Shafi'i right there. Al-Tabari is Shafi'i. And what did he say? He said, well, the Shafi'i, he based it on this ayah and said everything that the Quran was quiet about then would be regarded as permissible to consume. just by looking at this ayah and said, well, unless you have the evidence. And there was another opinion that basically said, well, actually, here's a response. This ayah was in response, in refuting basically a particular thing, which is their religious type of practices and the rituals that the pagan Arabs had come in. And therefore, this was coming with an exclusive answer, and it wasn't necessarily saying that whatever is haram is only these matters or only these things. That's not what it's saying. So those scholars that basically said, well, you understood this ayah wrong. This isn't saying that only the things that are haram are only 1, 2, 3, 4, but it was saying that, hey, in response to what they had created in terms of ritual back then, this ayah is coming in to say, well, let me start with a foundation. And that foundation is to let you know that for food consumption, it's basically in terms of what is forbidden to eat, are there basically these 3 items right there. 3, ميتة, دم المسفوح, لحم الخنزير. Okay, now, and let's see, the other opinion, they said, well, we understand it differently. How do you understand it? They said, well, what we understand is that this ayah, when it said, لا أجد فيما أوحي إلي محرما, I do not find anything that is impermissible upon me, meaning during the time of revelation for that ayah. In other words, up until now, from the time of revelation for that ayah, up until now, I only know these things basically forbidden up until now. And that does not negate that later there would be a revelation and a clarification to give further more on the list and more things to be added on the list and basically making other things impermissible. Let's see. And he said, وَزَعَمَ ابْنُ الْعَرَبِيِّ أَنَّ هَذِهِ الْآيَةِ مَدَنِيَّةٌ مَكِّيَّةٌ. Why don't you look at that one? Are they both Maliki? Yes, they're both Maliki. But certain scholars, and one thing is that keeping in mind is that I prefer following a madhab than following a selected scholar. And the reason for that is that following a madhab, one, helps you learn the different areas within fiqh. That's number one. Number two is that following a madhab, you want to keep in mind that a madhab basically underwent a lot of scrutiny, and I would say organized scrutiny by those that adhere to that particular school. They did a lot of scrutiny, they did a lot of explanation, they basically did a lot of endorsement, a lot of research, a lot of this, and it basically had a type of an organization that helped make sure that this was all revised. But if you were to look at these random madhahib many times, let's say Abu Thawr, a great scholar, there's no question about that, but then do we really know for sure that that was his adopted opinion? Not always. And that sometimes can make things harder. I would trust Abu Thawr, but I'm not really sure whether he really had mentioned that one and what is the evidence and so forth. So when you look at an organized madhab, it helps you make sure that there are other scholars that had scrutinized those revisions, or at least those fatawas and those studies and those books, and they were revised and revised multiple times and taught multiple times, and basically a lot of shuruh were done to that particular madhab, and therefore it becomes somewhat of an organized ground and an organized basis that you could really depend on. But here's the catch. Sometimes when you stick to a certain madhab, the catch is sometimes the human mind can sometimes feel that it has to adhere to a certain idea, And whenever it is within one group that they become so blinded from accepting other scrutinies or other research and all these different things, and then they end up basically blinding themselves from seeing the flaws within their own madhab, because they can become so fanatic about their own madhab that they don't even see a flaw in it, and this can happen. So I like an organized madhab, definitely a lot safer, definitely, it's better to go and learn from a madhab, but you just got to keep in mind that sometimes there's a catch that you can be blinded from recognizing the flaws within your madhab, because it becomes a mindset that they would be teaching you, and you become so acquainted to it that you don't even recognize otherwise. You don't even recognize. And if somebody were to bring another opinion, because you had been so accustomed and so deeply rooted within that opinion, that it became as if it's a fact in your brain. And if anybody would bring about another opinion, or even if they managed to put all the evidence to support that opinion, you will realize that your brain had been so wired into a certain system that it becomes basically it becomes a two set of jobs for you to, one, unwire slash unlearn what you had learned, and then get into a new type of an education, a new type of discipline, a new type of rewiring. I right now I've been in Malaysia almost 2 years, and they drive on the other side of the road. Believe it or not, until now, I've been driving for almost 2 years now. And until now, I can make a mistake and drive again back on the other side of the road, basically based on the American system, without me realizing. My brain can sometimes just take that moment where it just goes into a pilot mode and it starts driving based on what I had been doing for the past perhaps maybe 17 years. And then it would still go there. All right. And sometimes, in order to make sure that I don't go into the wrong area, I would wait for other cars and see where they're going to make sure that I'm not taking the wrong lane. Guess what? That's the same thing in fiqh. It's not just in driving, but that's the same thing in fiqh, that you can wire yourself into believing in something, and then it becomes so hard to unwire it and rewire a new thought. Okay, now why did I like the word Za'am ibn al-Arabi? Because he said Ibn al-Arabi claimed. When you say claimed, even though he's on your side of madhab, but al-Qurtubi was not fanatic to his own madhab, but he regarded that he's fanatic to the evidence. He's fanatic, and yes, strict to the evidence, strict to whatever basically goes back to proving that it is authentic. That's what my madhab is. Yes, majority of his madhab is Maliki, but he would still consider that even if somebody was on my team, I'm not going to necessarily consider what they had said is necessarily right, but I would basically see the evidences that they basically put forth. Okay, let's see. He said, زعم ابن العربي أن هذه الآية مدنية. Said the Ibn al-Arabi had basically claimed that this ayah was madaniyah, and therefore you're, even though it's basically in a Meccan surah. So when you say it's madaniyah, what did he really want to say? That this ayah was revealed later, and that it is not within the context of refuting the ritual practices and the food preferences that the disbelievers, or at least the people of Quraysh, were practicing. Okay, then what? And he said majority had actually said that what was revealed unto the Prophet ﷺ on the day اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم, said nothing was revealed after that ayah as a nasikh, as an ayah to abrogate what was revealed, and therefore it is muhkama. Therefore, it is basically not abrogated and basically giving us a final revelation. And therefore, there's nothing that would be considered as haram except what was mentioned in this ayah. And Ibn al-Arabi said, and that's basically my preferred opinion. Al-Qurtubi said, well, I had seen others say what he said. Let's say Abu Umar ibn Abd al-Barr, also Maliki, okay? Also Maliki. In fact, he wrote this huge book. I think I told you about it before. It was a Tamheed to explain al-Muwatta, which is also Maliki. Of course, well, I would say it's, you know, the foundation of al-Madhab al-Maliki. Okay, he said al-Ijma'. He said all scholars had considered that there was an ijma', a unanimous agreement that what was revealed in Surah Al-An'am was actually Mecca, meaning it was from the early times of revelation, except قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُ مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَيْكُمْ, except this ayah and the other three ayat that relate to it, وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ هَادُوا, etc., and that it was basically revealed, and many ayat were revealed, or many basically sunan. So what did he want to say? He said, well, I would like to object. That's what he's saying. I would like to object and say, well, when you scrutinize this ayah, you see that all the ayat up until here was revealed in Mecca, but from this ayah, that things we would know that there were a lot of Quran that was revealed after this ayah, and a lot of explanation by the Prophet ﷺ that was mentioned and taught by the Prophet ﷺ after this ayah. So therefore, we would say, considering al-khamr did not happen, even though it was not mentioned in this ayah, it wasn't mentioned in this ayah, but we would say that al-khamr was mentioned later to being haram. In other words, this ayah cannot be exclusive to these are the only things that are haram. And he said, we know that alcohol was considered as haram in Medina later on, as in Surah Al-Ma'idah, and all the scholars had basically agreed that the Prophet ﷺ had forbidden the consumption of all the different animals that have canine teeth, and that was not but in Medina. And all of that basically indicates that it was a revelation in Medina, or at least it was not necessarily exclusive. Okay, here's the thing. Al-Qurtubi wanted to say, well, that is the place of dispute. He said, you cannot necessarily claim an ijma' on all of this when you recognize that there's a place of dispute between scholars. So in other words, your claim of a unanimous agreement on something is really, remember, it's at the place of dispute, so you can't really say that there was a unanimous agreement on that. And therefore, some other scholars had basically said, well, all the evidence to speak about the carnivore animals and all of that, they considered that that came later, and that we are supposed to be taking basically that evidence, and how do we deal with that? He said, well, what we have to recognize is that those that had said it was haram, they basically had seen the evidence to prove that it's haram. And they had considered Surah Al-An'am, the ones that said that carnivore animals and basically other substances are haram. They looked at Surah Al-An'am and they said, well, that's Mecca. That basically was revealed early from the early revelations, and that it was revealed before the migration of the Prophet ﷺ to Medina. And what this ayah was really in response to was in response to the ritual practices in regards to animals that basically the different mushrikeen were embracing, and they were practicing and all of that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting them know that that is basically at the early times of revelation. And then many matters were basically revealed as impermissible, such as domestic well, they're called donkeys, okay, but here they call them humur insiya, meaning domestic donkeys, because they considered zebras as donkeys, but they considered them as wild donkeys, okay? And al-bighal, mules, as in the hadith that was narrated by Jabir. Okay, what about it? That he said that the Prophet ﷺ had said, حرم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لحوم الحمر الأهلية ولحوم البغال وغيرها وكل ذي ناب من السباع وكل ذي مخلب من الطير. Jabir ibn Abdullah basically said the Prophet ﷺ had regarded the flesh of basically the domestic donkeys, that's what we call them, or even the flesh of mules, or even the basically the flesh or eating anything that is a carnivore, or even an animal, a bird that is a carnivore that has claws, basically. Abu Umar, even though he's the same Abu Umar as the one before, basically said, well, what we would understand based on that is that there's nothing that's considered haram unless it basically had not mentioned the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, by that premise, well, then you're going to say, if you are going to say that, hey, that ayah was the last thing revealed, based on that premise, you're basically going to say that things like alcohol is permissible. If you're going to say that that's the last ayah in Revelation in terms of what is impermissible, and we know that that is actually not true, and that's what scholars unanimously agreed. Now there's a unanimous point, unanimously agreed that alcohol, basically from squeezed grapes, that there's a strong evidence that the Prophet ﷺ had basically forbidden that, and so did the ayah. We talk about an ayah that forbid that, and even when we're speaking about forbidding those animals, or that alcohol, or even the different animals. Let's see, there are differences of opinion. So just like we had seen Ibn Khuwaizim and Dad, we had seen Imam Malik basically had multiple opinions. We had seen Ibn Abdul Barr, we had seen Abu Umar right there, Ibn Abdul Barr, basically having differences of opinions in the madhab. And this is extremely important. Sometimes within one madhab, you can have multiple opinions. Let's keep that one in mind. There is something called al-ma'mul bihi fil madhab, the dominant opinion within that madhab, but even within that madhab, you can have multiple opinions, just to keep that in mind. So you would have to probably need to go for madhab al-Hanbali, for example. You might need to go for al-Mirdawi, al-Insaf fi ma'rifat al-Rajih min al-Khilaf, to make sure that, hey, what is the dominant opinion in the madhab Hanbali, or in the madhab Shafi'i, basically go for a Nawawi or a Rafi'i, or in the madhab Maliki, perhaps see Ibn Abdul Barr and what he says, or perhaps maybe go to the main scholars in al-madhab al-Maliki to see what that madhab basically, I guess, has as a popular opinion. Okay, just keeping that one in mind, because many times people would think, well, what does the Maliki madhab say? And I would say, well, There are multiple opinions in that Maliki madhab. Within the madhab, yes, within the madhab. Within one madhab, you can have 9, 10, 20, and sometimes even more different opinions just on one matter. And that's why he said, well, even upon Malik himself, you would see, even upon Malik himself, you would see multiple opinions in regards to the flesh of carnivore animals, donkeys, mules. In one point, he said it was impermissible because of the ahadith that were narrated for that. And he said, and this is basically the accepted or at least the strong opinion in regards to what we would see in al-Muwatta. What is al-Muwatta? Al-Muwatta, it's I mean, you can have a copy you could have a copy in one book, what's going to be almost 800 pages, okay? But the font is going to be extremely small. But if you were to have it in a number of different volumes, you can have it almost 4 volumes, 3 volumes. Well, it depends on if you're including the glossary and all of that relates it. In another narration upon Malik, he said it was makruha. Wait, the first time you said haram? Yes, that was the first one. It was haram. And the second one that he said it was makruh. Yes, makruh to meaning that it is hated. And that's basically what we would see, basically supported by what we would see in al-Mudawwana. Let me just explain a little bit about al-Mudawwana and al-Muwatta. Well, in both al-Mudawwana and al-Muwatta, they basically go back to the different narrations that Imam Malik had basically compiled. Okay, but al-Mudawwana, it would basically have more narrations and different narrations. So you had Asad ibn al-Furat, you had Sahnun, and the list goes on and on. Okay, just to keep that in mind. And then you had these scholars within Imam Malik's madhab. Okay, they would basically be the ones to later be the main teachers. In Tunisia, in Algeria, in Mauritania, Morocco, etc., Libya. They would be the main teachers, and it became basically like a trace. It would be a teacher that taught al-Mudawwana, and this teacher basically stayed in one particular area, and then the students. So if you were to look at al-Madhab Maliki in Morocco, you might see some variance in what would be considered as basically the Maliki madhab, maybe in Guinea or maybe in Mali. Okay, they're Maliki, but you would see some variance. Why? Because in Mali, perhaps they were influenced by al-Madhab al-Zahiri there, but maybe for perhaps in Morocco, there's a different trace right there. So just keep that one in mind. Okay, so, but here's one thing. There was a narration upon Ibn Abbas, Ibn Umar, and the Sayyida Aisha. Wait, those are Sahaba, right? Yes, those are Sahaba. What about them? That it was actually permissible to eat these. Eat what? Eat carnivore animals, eat donkeys, and eat mules. No, you better be kidding me. Yeah, there was a narration that basically said that. So where's that narration? And how do we get to that? Well, you can go to these references, Tamhid ibn Abdul Barr, Istithkar, basically, Ibn Abdul Barr as well. And in fact, there's even an opinion for al-Awza'i. Al-Awza'i, where is he from? Lebanon. Al-Awza'i is from Lebanon. And he also adopted this. Wait, was he Maliki madhab? No, he wasn't Maliki madhab. He had his own madhab. He himself was basically a madhab himself. You know, a sad truth about al-Awza'i, guess how he died? Carbon monoxide. Yeah. So he basically was in his house and basically forgot the fire flaming, and he died of carbon monoxide, basically suffocation. So yeah, very sad. All right. Al-Bukhari had basically mentioned hadith. Let's see, or at least this part. Let's see. He said that Amr ibn Dinar, he came to Jabir ibn Zayd and he said, they are claiming that the Prophet ﷺ had forbidden the flesh of donkey's meat. And they said, or he responded, let's see what he said, قد كان يقول ذلك الحكم بن عمرو الغفاري عندنا بالبصرة لكن أبى ذلك البحر بن عباس. He said, well, that was what al-Hakam ibn Amr al-Ghafari in Basra, in al-Iraq used to say, but Ibn Abbas, and he called him al-Bahr, al-Bahr, ocean. Yeah, but this is a metaphor right there, talking about his ilm, that it is an ocean. It is so deep, basically, and recited this ayah. Okay, so what are we saying right there? I mean, now you're saying that we can eat lions and tigers and bears as basically our new steak. Let's continue. Hold on. This is going to be exciting. Okay, Ibn Umar was asked about, look at this one. I want you to listen to this one. This one's really way off. Okay, so let's say Ibn Umar was asked about the flesh of carnivore animals. And he said, nothing wrong with it. So then he was told, look at what he was told. He was told about the hadith of Abu Tha'lab al-Khushani. Is that a Sahabi? Yeah, that's a Sahabi. And he said, we will not leave the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a man that would urinate over his legs. Whoa. Really? He would say such a thing? Well, what does he even mean? He's basically saying, I'm going to consider that the ayah is muhkama and that's final, and therefore whatever he is saying, I don't know of, but I will tell you one thing, he probably doesn't even know the basics of tahara. That's what he's saying. When he says Arabi, that urinates over his feet or legs, he just wanted to say, well, he doesn't even know the rulings of tahara, let alone even know about the rulings of perhaps food and consumption and all of that. That's what that inference is basically saying. Really? Oh, man. Let's see. Is that really true? Let's see. Here, Ibn Abd al-Bar said, well, sorry, but that's actually not an authentic narration. And he said, quote, هذه الرواية عن ابن عمر ولم نقف على قوله لا ندع, and the rest. Ibn Abd al-Bar, he said, in fact, we don't really have any evidence to support that Ibn Umar had actually said this quote. Which quote? Basically this quote. Okay, let's say, Ash-Sha'bi, who is not a Sahabi, but is a Tabi'i, he was asked about elephant flesh and lion flesh, and he recited this ayah. I mean, I don't know how you're, and he said, أخرجه عبد الرزاق. So Abd al-Razzaq, basically, what do elephants eat anyways? Are they, I mean, they have this ivory, but what do elephants eat? Do they actually, are they considered carnivores? I have no idea. Okay, let's see. Al-Qasim. Al-Qasim is Abdul Rahman ibn al-Qasim. He's also a great Maliki scholar. And he said, Sayyidah Aisha used to say when she used to hear people say that that everything that had a canine tooth was basically haram, she used to say, well, that's actually halal. And she would recite this ayah, which what we're doing, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِي مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا. And then she said, well, the Prophet ﷺ would see the redness from the blood even. So she was wanting right there. She said, دَمًا مَسْفُوحًا. She said the Prophet ﷺ would even see the redness of that blood. See, when you slaughter the meat, and you would basically, get it ready in preparation for cooking. And certainly there's still going to be some meat, some blood in the veins. And then she said, well, the Prophet ﷺ would even see that there would be some redness of that blood coming out of the meat, and it would basically go on top, and basically the water would basically have some redness, and the Prophet ﷺ did not say that was haram. Let's see Al-Qurtubi. After, now we're seeing Sahaba disputing. If Sahaba can dispute, well, certainly the scholars are going to dispute as well, because the Sahaba, they're actually the reference that these scholars would go back to. So if Sahaba can get into this dispute, how do we understand this? Am I going to be making my next steak basically be tiger meat? Let's say this is interesting. Not that I have it available, but anyhow. And he said, and what is actually preponderant is what we had started out with saying, and that what was revealed in this ayah and the things that were later revealed either by Quran or by Sunnah was going to be an appendix and basically added to it. In other words, the haram things are not exclusive to what was mentioned here, but that was basically at a certain stage of the time when the ayat were still, or at least were revealed in early times, and that all the other things were going to be added to it. Al-Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, he basically said, let's see, he basically said, well, what we say, what we would say is that Ibn Abbas, he basically said, يكره أكل السباع. Okay. فقال, oh, sorry. Let me requote this. That was البغداديون. روي عن ابن عباس أن هذه الآية من آخر ما نزل. There was a narration that Ibn Abbas said, well, this was one of those ayat that were revealed basically at the end, the part of those ayat that were revealed at the end. البغداديون من أصحابنا. البغداديون من أصحابنا, like Ibn Khuwaizim, basically the Maliki scholars that are in Baghdad. They said everything other than that is halal, but look at that one. They said it would be hated to eat the carnivore animals. Really? Okay, let's see. Malik, Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, and Abd al-Malik, that eating anything that basically has a canine tooth is impermissible, and that would not basically object any addition on this ayah. So just because the ayah says لا أجد فيما أوحي إلي محرما, I find nothing that is impermissible but 1, 2, 3 items, this is not to say that that was exclusive, but other things can be included if we basically would have an evidence that was coming from a wahi. Just as, and similar to, the Prophet ﷺ said in this hadith, لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث. He said that the only times when capital punishment and basically execution is permissible is only in these 3 matters. And he mentioned al-kufr, zina, and even zina basically for somebody that is muhsan, and al-qatl, in killing somebody. But he said, but we know that the reasons to execution or basically capital punishment is more than just these 3. In other words, we could say that the Prophet ﷺ would let us know that up till that time of revelation, that this was what was revealed up till that time of revelation, and that in al-wahi, there can be other things that can, 1, confirm or abrogate, or even may consider a certain amount or regulation, etc. And he said that we have strong evidence and authentic evidence that was thabit, that was evident, that was authentic, that eating anything that basically has a canine tooth from the carnivore animals is basically haram. And he said we basically have those evidences in Sahih Muslim, we got it in al-Muwatta, and we basically have it in Musnad Ahmad as well. And he said we also have that the Prophet ﷺ had forbid eating from anything that basically has a carnivore tooth, and every bird that also has claws. If the bird has claws, like hawks, 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 and in eagles, okay, those are the ones that I could think of right now. They basically would be considered as impermissible. Vultures, they also have claws. Okay, and of course, in Sahih Muslim, that would actually mean that this is authentic, that the Prophet ﷺ نهى عن أكل كل ذي ناب من السباع, that the Prophet ﷺ had forbid eating anything that has a canine tooth from basically those animals. And he said, وَالْأَوَّلُ أَصَحُّ وتحريم كل ذي ناب من السباع هو صريح المذهب وبه ترجم مالك في الموطأ حين قال تحريم أكل كل ذي ناب من السباع ثم ذكر الحديث. Okay. وهو الأمر عندنا فأخبر أن العمل اضطرد مع الأثر. Quote, he said, and the first opinion, which basically means that it's haram, he said, and this is the dominant opinion within the Maliki madhab, is that anything that basically is having a canine tooth from the carnivore animals, that's basically right there haram. And he said, وَبِهِ تَرْجَمَ مَالِكٌ فِي الْمُوطَأ. What is tarjama? Tarjama like translate? No. What is tarjama then? So tarjama actually means to put a main guideline, kind of like when you name a chapter. So that's the name of a chapter. What did he say? He said, for as a name for that chapter, تحريم أكل كل ذي ناب من السباع. The chapter of basically the prohibition of eating anything that has a canine tooth from the animals that are carnivore animals, and then mentioned the hadith. And he said, and this is the madhab that we are going to adopt. And therefore, the action that we would basically see that the Sahaba themselves in the Athar basically had practiced. So keeping that part of it, and Al-Qushayri basically said, well, this ayah is from the last things that were revealed, and therefore just recognizing that one. And he said, and what supports this opinion is that the ijma' basically that scholars had unanimously agreed that things like human feces or even urine or even the different insects, the dirty different insects, and certainly we're talking about donkeys and so forth, even though not mentioned in the ayah. But we know that all scholars had considered that there's a unanimous agreement that these things are haram, even though they're not mentioned in the ayah, which in other words would be a discrepancy for those that said, well, no, nothing else is haram. But you would say that feces or urine or even different disgusting insects or disgusting animals or even donkeys, you would regard it as haram, wouldn't you? Well, yeah. Well, that's not mentioned in that ayah, but you would still take it. So then are you really in discrepancy with yourself? So just learning how to, I guess, be into that fiqh. Okay, we're going to stop right here because I know that it's late for many of you. So we're going to stop right there. Inshallah, tomorrow we're going to be continuing point number 2. And if there are any questions, I was really hoping to go farther and discuss those other animals. Let's say I was really hoping to discuss, our best friends. Well, yeah, now he's going to be our best friend. Well, not him. Doesn't look so happy. And yeah, definitely not that. Well, I mean, this guy's posing great for the camera, but anyhow. So inshallah, tomorrow we will continue with point number 2. There are 4 different points. Any questions before we end? I know we kind of went in details, but I want you to taste that fiqh. Nothing like it. Even if, I may take you into all these, how they responded to each other. And sometimes if somebody is not well-versed in fiqh, they may get confused. But, just in the beginning, you'll get confused. But later on, you'll kind of start delving deep and you'll be able to get into this, what we would call al-malaka al-fiqhiyya. What is al-malaka? It becomes like a skill. You start tasting fiqh, and then it basically blends within your body. And then you start feeling that fiqh is you. And then it becomes nothing but the way you visualize the world. And it becomes basically your favorite. Why? Because you start seeing the world through fiqh. Fiqh, even though, yes, I'm doing tafsir and I love tafsir, but I cannot help but love fiqh deeply because it helps you see the paradigms, even though many people may not see it, but then you start seeing these paradigms of how do I go back to these evidences? How do I scrutinize them? How do I study it? How do I make sure that I'm not making my own understanding? I'm making my own, I guess, culture. Or how do I make sure that I'm basically following the right opinion? How do I put these pieces together? How do I make sure that I'm not indoctrinated by it, whether by my own culture or by other cultures, or even American culture or whatever? Of course, the American culture wants to claim that, yeah, we're basically not following culture, and that, of course, based on Christian or atheist, if they want to say whatever group, whether you're talking about Democrats, Republicans, liberals, socialists, whatever you want to call it, just on the side. Okay, just to end it. It was so funny yesterday. So this reporter, basically completely off topic, but I had to say it and share it. So the reporter basically tells Trump that what he thinks of those that would say that Zohran Mamdani, the guy that is right now running for New York, and whether he would agree that he kind of gets that same type of personality, inspiration to basically go against the masses and basically have the guts to say it despite how people may disagree with it. And then his response was that he's more handsome than Zohran Mamdani. It's like, how's that even relevant? And plus, how on earth did you think that you were more handsome? Sorry. And how on earth would a president speak like a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old girl? I'm prettier, That's a conversation that you would hear, these little girls, not even boys, girls basically, competing in appearance. I'm prettier because I basically look like this and this and this. And a president of in fact, the greatest country in the world, at least great in its, let's say in this supremacy of its and hegemony and all of that it's basically doing. I don't necessarily agree with everything that the government is doing, of course, but I would definitely regard that America is the one that's supporting Israel and the genocide and all of that. But, yeah, thinking like a 6 and a 7-year-old girl, I'm actually more handsome. I'm prettier. Yeah, whatever. That's the level that we're at in our politicians and their smart responses. Yeah, smart. Okay. So enough about, this idea that just popped up in my head. Okay. Any questions before we get other ideas popping up in our head? Okay. Any ideas or any questions or any, I guess, suggestions? I'd be happy to hear them, inshallah. You can unmute yourselves. Okay, my friends, they don't want to unmute themselves. Okay, what I'm going to do. Okay, here we go. Iram, you want to say something, dear?
No. You
No?
just you said unmute, so that is that. No.
Neutral?
Yes, neutral. Actually,
You're neutral in regards to what? In regards to what?
Neutral to but whatever the points you said. Actually, I want to discuss one thing, but that will be very boring for everyone else.
So
about
hold
the
on, hold
fikr.
on. So you're neutral in regards to the canine teeth and the carnivore animals? So you're going to be making your new biryani lion's meat?
No, actually, I've been thinking one thing. I mean, I always wonder why people think, I mean, are not we given just certain criteria to decide what we can eat or what we can't eat? You
That's it. So you're like, you know what? You just tell us the conclusion and I'll take it. Fair enough, fair enough. Fair enough. That's why I, here's the thing. I would just say the conclusion, make the story short, and basically do something like the 101 Islamic studies classes and basically give you that and just, not get you into all that conversation. But I personally respect my audience
Mhm.
and I would like them to see what actually exists in the books of fiqh, in the books of tafsir, in the Islamic literature. And I don't want to make it a 101 and treat them like they're, just basically new reverts. And I'm just going to give you the conclusion, just basically tell you that. But I want you to basically know the evidences and know the debate because I want to create within us the deep understanding and respect for the texts, and respect for the scholars that didn't necessarily just accept an answer just because someone said it. That's the key thing. I know you're not going to be making your, I don't know, tiger meat biryani, or I don't know, instead of butter chicken, maybe perhaps butter lizard. I know for sure you're not going to be doing that. Okay. But I just want us to learn how strong our Islamic foundations are. That's the most important thing. Okay. And
Yes.
that's the key thing. I know that we're all going to agree that, none of us are going to go hunting for tigers and lions and bears to make our new steak and I don't know, matluba and whatever it is. But I'm just wanting us to know that those opinions are there. This is how scholars tackled them. And most importantly, especially during our times when people are bringing in all these ideas that are not heard of, and then they would become misconceptions to many. And I would say once we get people are so basic in their level of understanding in Islam, they become very, I guess, susceptible and very fragile to accept a lot of these misconceptions. Misconceptions, they become easy to manipulate when someone is not well grounded. But when you are well grounded in understanding your evidences, or understanding your resources, and understanding your interpretations, and understanding all of those, then you then had become an advanced person to just become well versed in recognizing a misconception, refuting the misconception, and even be a person that even develops different ways to also probably be at the level of ijtihad. So yeah, I hope I explained that one.
Mm.
I can't hear you, dear. You want to say something?
No, no, yes. Actually, I just wonder, like people here in Pakistan, I mean, people from the different sect, right? They say, once I saw in meat shop, there was a rabbit.
Rabbit is not
So,
haram, dear.
so that, I mean, I think it is, I mean, I never thought about eating rabbit. So I get like, yes, I was told that actually some people think that this is halal.
It is
Some
halal.
people say, yeah, some people say fish with the, you see, with the scale. they
The
don't.
Hanafis do say that fish with scale is haram. And you guys are Hanafi, so things like shrimp is haram to you, at least, and I'm not saying for you in particular, but I'm telling you, Hanafis, like Pakistanis, they won't eat shrimp because they think that it's haram because it comes from the Hanafi madhab. Hanafi would consider something has a scale then or a shell that it is haram. So things like lobsters, things like shrimp, like I said. What else? I can't think of something right now. I'm not a seafood and a seafood eater, so I'm not really good at that. But yes, for the Hanafis, they would regard that as haram.
No, shrimps, they like it is very common here, by the way. Shrimps are
What
very common here
shrimp
in
became
Pakistan.
common? It became common?
It, yeah, it is to eat that. I mean, I don't think.
Okay, well, that's really new. They're starting to adapt, starting to adapt, but I guess it became a thing. I would be one, I would be I guess intrigued to know what the elderly thinks of that. Because for the elderly, for sure, they're gonna be, that's it, takfir left and right for you guys. You guys lost your Islam, they're gonna tell you.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I wanted to say something because the sea is in Karachi. It's
Yes,
not in
this is the reason.
India, so they don't know much
So they
about.
adopted a new madhab, basically. That looks too good for us to adopt that old madhab, right?
That's funny.
So that I guess that kind of explains what I was talking about earlier, that people will have a new madhab, or let's say a new adaptation and a new fatwa based on sometimes the terrain and the geographical area. So if you're talking about Karachi, basically, adopting a different fatwa than probably the Punjab area. All right. So that explains how sometimes the terrain has an influence on what fatwa and which opinion should we basically adopt. Ustaza Umayya, what did you want to say, dear?
Bismillah. Regarding to the fiqh issues, one time you said something great about fiqh. I guess I want to. You said that fiqh is the map of Quran or Deen.
Absolutely. It's the
I like
GPS
it.
map.
Map
Absolutely.
of Quran or Deen. You said it one time. Yes.
Both.
Oh,
Both.
yeah.
Both. So
I
when you
like it.
look at, you can see it as a map, and you could also see it if you were to, I guess, if you were a tailor, okay, if you were a tailor, you would have all these different pieces of cloth, and then in order to put them together to create a garment, you would need to sew them all together. That fiqh is basically what sews those pieces together.
Okay.
It sews those pieces together. Without sewing it, you're just going to feel that, okay, there's this piece of cloth and that one, how do I put these together? And you're going to see all that aura basically starting to to get exposed. But then the fiqh connects these pieces together to help you see a vision, to help you basically create the garment of what really makes your Muslim identity. Because with the fashion, of course, you're going to create an identity. Okay. When I say fashion, I'm not just talking about appearance, but I'm actually talking about a practice. I'm talking about a culture. I'm talking about why, of course, when people wear things, they wear things because and even their clothes, it basically is a reflection of, you see people living in mountainous areas, they would wear clothes that are completely different than the areas that are living in like the Gulf. They don't have to wear something underneath this. It's a long abaya, but Pakistanis, because of the mountainous areas, they would basically wear what they would call sharwal and qamis. Because if you needed to climb these mountains, you cannot do it with a abaya. So it became their culture, basically designed a certain fashion of clothes. Okay. Same thing if you were to look at, hot climate areas. You were to look at Sudan, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uplift what's happening there right now. And you were to look at Mauritania, very baggy clothes, very, very loose clothes. Why? Because such a hot climate that you needed something that is not sticking to the body to make sure that there's enough airflow and that their body is not trapped in this heat. So yeah, you could see different, and that's the same thing with a garment. Okay, when you talk about fiqh, yes, there's one side that it's basically reflecting how you put these pieces together, these ideas, these different texts, these different evidences. And there's the other part, which is how do you put that into practice with people's lives, with people's culture, with people's basically experiences? How does that apply? And how do you put it into that connection? And number three, basically with that interpretation, how do you create a vision? A new vision to understand our social dynamics, how to get close, how to go farther, our rights, responsibilities, and all of that. So when you talk about fiqh, you talk about a map of Quran or a map of Islam, and you also talk about its tailoring, those different pieces of Quran, Sunnah, al-Athar, basically what the Sahaba described, all of these different things, you're connecting it together to make a garment to help you know how to fit it in, to basically fit in your identity. That's what fiqh is. Without fiqh, you're just completely lost in taking this part of hadith, this part of ayah, and this athar, and you're like, okay, how do I put the pieces together? That's why you need fiqh. Fiqh is that tailor that connects these pieces together to help you see it, and then to help you basically get a vision. Beautiful.
So if I want to reflect this on the ayah 145, قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِي مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا, how can I apply this fiqh on this ayah?
Absolutely. I mean, right now we could see this ayah is basically telling me, well, is it exclusive to this? Or how do I understand how the other scholars understood it? So all that we were discussing is basically letting me know, like, okay, my food. Well, food reflects part and a crucial thing about how you live, and certainly what's actually making as the foundation of what nutrients you put in, right? So this creates a mindset where, we can't underestimate the implication of food on our behavior. We say, hey, we already know sugar, and they're telling us, hey, sugar creates hyperactivity. And then, of course, they're talking to us about obesity and how it makes the brain shrink and all of these different things. Like never before do we see studies basically telling us about different foods and what they contain and how they affect the brain, how they affect the bone mass, muscles, and basically the different body activity and all of that. Like never before in history do we understand and fully understand the impact of food and nutrients, not only on the function of body, but even on our soul in our qalb. So when you look at that ayah, you're like, okay, how do I understand this? Oh, I want you to connect it with the other ayat. I want you to connect it with the other hadith that basically said that, yes, there are certain other elements or other different species or other things that are also haram. And that ayah is letting us know that it's not exclusive to it. So that's what we learn. All right.
جزاك الله خيرا فتح الله عليك ما شاء الله.
آمين يا ربي. So this is it. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. Stay tuned for our friends. And yes, I mean, really cute. Okay, we'll see.
Open appetite.
How many friends are we going to be talking about? Hold on. We're going to be talking about this guy. Wait a minute. What is he?
Lizard?
No, this guy, I don't know, that looks like a kangaroo, but he's pretending to be a mouse or identifies as a mouse.
Wish not to dream with it.
Exactly. And this guy who definitely is saying, stay back, I ain't gonna be your next steak. And he's cutely posing for a camera. So inshallah, stay tuned for tomorrow, because hey, you may be making your new biryani with a different
new dish.
Exactly. A new dish. I mean, hey, you never know. You could be missing out on something. Or maybe, I don't know, frogs. They're talking to us about frogs. We're going to talk about frogs too. Really? The right here, you could see, the Chinese restaurants basically serving frogs and all of that as one of the main dishes, and fried frog legs and all of that. I mean, it's not my favorite.
But it's makruh, frog.
Is it makruh or is it haram? Stay tuned for our basically our friends, and let's see how we're going to relate to them. Are we going to pet them? Are we going to eat them? Or are we going to say, you know what, you can just pose for the camera, nice to look at you, and we can just go.
So prepare the recipe, please.
Exactly. So yeah, let's just prepare, inshallah.